Have you ever noticed how quickly a person changes once a role gives them permission? A uniform, a title, a rule book. Sometimes that is all it takes for someone ordinary to become colder, harsher, more certain of their right to control. And just as quietly, it can make someone else smaller, quieter, easier to manage. The unsettling part is not that this happened in a prison. The unsettling part is that the study suggests this shift can begin almost anywhere people stop seeing each other as individuals. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo led the Stanford Prison Experiment to explore a disturbing question. When cruelty appears inside prisons, is it mainly the result of certain personalities, or does the environment itself shape behavior? The study drew from a pool of 75 men who answered an advertisement for a psychological study of prison life. After interviews, tests, and screening, 24 were selected as physically and mentally stable, mature, and least involved in antisocial behavior. They were randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners, and each was paid $15 per day. That matters because the study was not built around obvious villains. It was built around people chosen for being comparatively normal. And that is why it still lingers. It suggests that what people become under pressure may not begin with monstrous intentions. It may begin with structure, with anonymity, with power, with repetition. In other words, with conditions many people encounter in ordinary life in softer forms: offices, schools, institutions, online groups, families, hierarchies. The prison itself was staged in the Stanford Psychology Building. Small cells were built. Rules were established. Guards wore khaki uniforms, whistles, reflective sunglasses, and carried police-style clubs. Prisoners were arrested unexpectedly at home, taken through booking procedures, blindfolded, brought to the mock prison, stripped, sprayed with deodorant as a delousing substitute, given smock-like uniforms, nylon caps, and chains around one ankle. They were no longer addressed by name, only by number. That detail matters more than it first appears. Because the study was not only about walls and locked doors. It was about identity. The moment a person is reduced to a category, a number, a role, something begins to erode. Research language calls part of this de-individuation, the weakening of personal identity inside a group role. The guards were made more uniform. The prisoners were made less individual. The entire design pushed both sides away from seeing a full person in front of them. And the shift was fast. Within hours, some guards began harassing prisoners. At 2:30 in the morning, whistles blasted for counts. On day 2, the prisoners rebelled by tearing off their numbers, removing their caps, and barricading themselves in their cells. The guards responded by calling reinforcements, using a fire extinguisher to force prisoners back, stripping them, removing beds, isolating ringleaders, and creating a privileged cell to reward compliant prisoners and divide the group. Here is the first uncomfortable insight: people do not need years to adapt to a system. Sometimes they need less than a day. The study showed that both guards and prisoners were settling into their roles very quickly. Guards became increasingly authoritarian and abusive. Prisoners became passive, anxious, submissive, and emotionally distressed. The experiment was planned for 2 weeks, but it was terminated after only 6 days because of the intensity of what was happening. By day 3, the prison no longer looked like students pretending. It looked like a social reality that had taken hold. Prisoners were forced to do push-ups, sometimes with other prisoners sitting on them. They cleaned toilets by hand. They were subjected to insults, pointless chores, sleep disruption, and group punishment. Fear began doing what force alone cannot do. It made prisoners regulate themselves. Some tried to stay invisible. Some scolded others for breaking rules. Some informed on each other. Compliance was no longer simply obedience. It was becoming survival. This is why the study still feels personally relevant. Because many people imagine control as something dramatic and obvious. But often control becomes strongest when it is internalized. When a person starts thinking, it is safer not to speak. It is better not to stand out. Maybe the rules are there for my own good. That is when power no longer has to push as hard. The person begins helping it. Less than 36 hours in, prisoner 8612 suffered an acute breakdown, with uncontrollable crying, anger, and disorganized thinking. Later, prisoner 819 also broke down. While he was sobbing in another room, the other prisoners were made to chant that he was a bad prisoner. Hearing that, he became overwhelmed with guilt. Zimbardo had to remind him that this was only an experiment, that the guards and prisoners were students, and that he could leave. That reminder itself reveals how deep the illusion had become. That may be the study's most rewatchable insight. People can intellectually know something is artificial and still emotionally submit to it as if it were real. The archival details in the material make that clear. When a Catholic priest visited, many prisoners identified themselves by number rather than by name. Some even asked him to help them get a lawyer. In monitored private conversations, almost 90% of what prisoners talked about concerned prison conditions, while only about 10% concerned life outside. The system had colonized attention. It had taken over not only behavior, but thought. And then there is the second unsettling insight: power can become rewarding to the people who hold it. The materials describe guards who enjoyed acting authoritatively and who later admitted that power felt pleasurable. The study also notes that some guards went beyond their assigned role into what the authors described as creative cruelty and harassment, while a few remained passive. The point is not that every person becomes brutal. The point is that a structure can make brutality feel normal, functional, even satisfying. That is why this study is not only about prisons. It is about what happens when a system gives one group permission to define reality for another group. When one side decides what counts as obedience, what counts as failure, what counts as disrespect, and what counts as punishment, the psychological landscape changes. The person below begins anticipating consequences. The person above begins assuming entitlement. By day 5, prisoners had become so psychologically trapped that many behaved as though quitting was not really an option, even though technically they could leave. The study materials connect this to learned helplessness. When people come to believe that what they do has little effect on outcomes, they begin to stop trying. In the prison, unpredictable rules and arbitrary punishments taught that resistance changed little. So passivity spread. This is where the study turns from a historical experiment into a mirror. Because many people know this feeling outside any literal prison. A workplace where standards change depending on who is in power. A relationship where the emotional climate is unpredictable. A school or family where avoiding punishment becomes more important than being honest. After enough arbitrary control, people often do not become calmer. They become watchful. They start rehearsing how not to trigger consequences. They speak less. They doubt their own instincts. They become easier to direct. That is not weakness. It is adaptation to uncertainty. So how does this explain what people experience in daily life? It explains why titles matter more than logic. Why a manager, teacher, moderator, officer, or partner may seem to change once a role gives them cover. It explains why a group can become colder when everyone is following procedure. It explains why a person may comply with something uncomfortable not because it makes sense, but because the environment makes resistance feel expensive. And it explains why, once identity is reduced to a function, empathy becomes easier to postpone. The practical lesson is subtle. When a system begins turning people into roles, the first thing worth protecting is personhood. Names instead of labels. Specificity instead of category. Private thought instead of absorbed group logic. A small act of psychological resistance is to notice when language becomes impersonal, when rules become arbitrary, and when someone begins to feel less like a person and more like a position. That moment matters, because the study suggests the deeper damage does not begin with overt abuse. It begins with normalization. The experiment ended on day 6 after Christina Moslik, a recent Stanford PhD, saw the conditions and objected, confronting the ethical harm and the behavior of the guards. Zimbardo later acknowledged how deeply he had slipped into the role of prison superintendent rather than remaining only a research psychologist. Even the observer had been changed by the system he created. And that may be the final insight. The study is often remembered for what the guards did to the prisoners. But another question stays behind. How many people around a harmful system stop seeing it clearly because they have already adapted to it? That is why this experiment still produces analytical discomfort. Not because it revealed something rare, but because it revealed something familiar. How quickly people can submit to structure. How quickly they can enjoy authority. How quickly reality can narrow until the artificial feels absolute. Have you ever felt yourself changing inside a role you did not fully choose? If this resonated, subscribe for more evidence-based psychology. Sometimes the mind does not need bars to feel imprisoned.